Garten of Banban Zero confirms that Kris is responsible for the death of December holiday in Deltarune. I recently played Deltarune on release day for 14 hours straight. It was amazing, but you don't need me to tell you that, right? You know that everyone thinks that the game is peak, and I'm not going to waste your time talking about all the insane lore bombs that sugar the community's understanding of the game and whatnot. However, I may be able to waste your time with something else. Garten of Banban. Yes, I know I'm making a Deltarune theory video that features Garten of Banban, but I promise, by the end of this video, you're gonna hate me. So, Garten of Banban is a lot like Deltarune, more than you might initially realize. They both started off as free demos featuring the first chapter of their stories, that also had merch stores on day one. They have funny jester characters, and of course lots of secrets and lore for MatPat to dissect frame by frame. But there was one particular moment in the Garten of Banban franchise, specifically Garten of Banban Zero, that inadvertently helped me solve Deltarune. I know that's a pretty wild thing to say off the bat, but if you'll just hear me out here, I think you might understand, so allow me to set the scene. In Garten of Banban Zero, you play as a character who is later revealed to be named Flumbo, a mutated Javanium mascot created by the Garten of Banban facility, a blue variant of Banban. You, as Flumbo, alongside younger versions of the other characters in the Banban franchise, are living in this restricted weirdcore-ass area, where you're given schoolwork and told to go around and socialize with the other characters. As we learn in Garten of Banban Zero, the titular Banban mascot is getting into a little bit of trouble with Flumbo. You see, Flumbo is kind and docile, while Banban is known to go into a bloodlusted rage over his favorite organ. That sounds really bad. Oh my god, pancreas, not anything else. So with Banban's bloodlust and no other kind of lust, he's not really the ideal child caretaker. And so Banban, in a fit for his own survival, makes a deal with a mascot doctor named Syringian to form a deal to get rid of Flumbo, to prevent them from replacing Banban. And how this ends up going down results in Banban playing a game of hide-and-seek with Flumbo near the end of the game. Banban claims to know the perfect hiding spot for Flumbo, a closet tucked away in a dark corner of the facility. Banban tells Flumbo to hide there, and so they do. And Flumbo remains there for years, alone in a dark closet. And they remain there for nearly the entire length of the franchise. Literally from Garten of Banban Zero all the way through to Garten of Banban 7. And mind you, these mascots are not normal life forms. Flumbo didn't die in the closet, he just stayed there, aware and awake in the darkness, just waiting for someone to eventually find him. Now, if any of this sounds sort of vaguely familiar, that's exactly how I felt, because this particular moment of Garten of Banban Zero sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole, mental spiral, whatever you want to call it, that ended up helping me solve the mystery of Deltarune. The idea of someone playing hide-and-seek only for the hider to become trapped and lost in their hiding place and then be forgotten, truly lost, well, it just reminded me a lot of December holiday. Des is Noelle's sister, a sister who went missing some time ago, and her disappearance plays a core backdrop to the lore and story unfolding in the world of Deltarune. Of course, her disappearance deeply affected people like Noelle, Carol, Rudy, her immediate family, but also people directly involved with the incident, such as Asgore and all of her friends, such as Kris. But just how badly did this event affect Kris? Well, to answer that, we can look to Kris's past. As we learn from Tenna in Chapter 3 of Deltarune, Kris and Des were friends, and Kris may have even looked up to Des, based on how Tenna describes them as being cool. And we of course see all the characters, including Kris and Des, hanging out together at the TV, something that Tenna makes a very clear note of. So it would make sense that Des disappearing would affect Kris quite a lot, as a childhood friend that ends up going missing is never something that's going to be easy to deal with. Obviously, we know that Kris was a kid when Des disappeared, and we know that they had a history with Des, but beyond that, we actually get more glimpses into Kris's history in the egg segments. If you don't know what the eggs are, maybe watch another Deltarune video, because I'm probably going to absolutely butcher this explanation here, but to summarize, in every chapter of Deltarune, there is a secret area where you can meet the Forgotten Man. We never actually see him, but he's identified by his theme song and the tree that he always manifests behind. And if you do find him, he gives you an egg. Now, at the moment, we know basically nothing about these eggs and what they specifically mean or do. At the moment, they're basically just a tally marker that shows how many times you've interacted with him successfully. But we do know a lot more about the man himself, so let's just focus on that. In Chapter 3 specifically, the identity and information surrounding the Forgotten Man is really jumbled up and strange and seemingly corrupted, but we do get a general understanding that the man and Kris are familiar with one another. After their conversation and the exchanging of the delicious egg, the man says they will meet with Kris again in, quote, that place, implying that both of them already know what he's talking about. And we learn what that place is in the following chapter. Chapter 4's egg room sets us in a mental hospital, where Kris, in their past, was seemingly once admitted to. Here we get a glimpse into them dealing with their past trauma, where we are shown that Kris is repressing some sort of memory. Their therapist, for lack of a better term here, tells them to draw to express how they're feeling, and they end up drawing something before covering it up with a tree, completely hiding it, much like the Forgotten Man being totally obscured by the tree. So whatever happened with Kris is something that they want to forget about, something that they want to hide, which of course begs the question, what is Kris trying to hide? Well, I think I have an idea. I'll just cut to the chase here. I would like to propose that Kris feels a certain level of responsibility for Des's disappearance. So first of all, where is Des? I mean, seriously, what could have possibly happened to them? Well, we do know that she didn't die. At least she didn't die before she went missing, and there is a lot of evidence pointing to this. Namely, how often she is described in official material as the lost girl. There's also the fact that Noelle is constantly trying to look for her, which she probably wouldn't do if she already knew that she was dead. But most importantly, she does not have a gravestone in the graveyard outside the church. So at least according to all the townspeople and people who knew her, she isn't definitively dead. So how did Des go missing? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there are a ton of signals connecting her with the shelter. Obviously, the code to open the door to the bunker is written inside of her guitar, and if it's to be believed that the individual trapped within the darkness of the game's files is Des, it would logically make sense that Des is implied to be trapped within the bunker. But what would Des be doing in there? Were they kidnapped? Were they, murdered and had their body dumped in the bunker to hide it? Well, if that was the case, then why would Kris be so against us, the player, entering the bunker? If we try to read the code hidden in the guitar, Kris rips the soul out of their body and hides it in order to hide the guitar from us. And when Susie eventually gets their hands on the guitar, Kris calls Carol, snitches on her to get Susie to return the guitar and kick her out. But hang on, wait. Kris was friends with Des. Carol is literally her mother. If anyone would want to open the bunker to try and find Des if she's down there, or at least get some sort of closure on her death and disappearance, it would be Kris and Carol. So why would they want to keep the bunker closed? Wouldn't they be the first ones in line to bust that shit wide open? Well, no. They don't want to open the bunker. They want to keep it closed. In fact, if we assume that Carol is the knight, then Carol is willing to kidnap Undyne and force her into the bunker in order to keep them from finding Des. And why? Well, I believe that it ties into the traumatic past that Kris has been trying to repress. A trauma that they went to therapy over. The trauma that is hidden behind a drawn tree. Kris is trying to suppress the fact that they are responsible for Des's disappearance. How did she disappear? Well, what's the most obvious way for a kid to disappear? It's for them to hide. I believe that Kris and Des, while they were kids, were playing a game of hide and seek, and that Des decided to hide in the bunker, never to emerge. We could go into the details about what exactly happened here to Des. Maybe Kris tried to play a mean-spirited prank on her by shutting the door behind her, only for it to lock in place and never be opened again. Or maybe Asgore had something to do with it. After all, we do know that people kind of hate Asgore in light of her disappearance. Maybe Asgore has something to do with the investigation of it. Maybe he couldn't get the door open. I really can't say for sure, but the core idea remains the same no matter what exactly happened. Des died because she played hide and seek with Kris, and Kris heavily blames themselves for this incident. Now, I'll admit, I am sort of pulling this out of nowhere here, but if this is actually how Des ended up disappearing, it would actually explain a lot of the mysteries currently surrounding Deltarune. For one, it explains exactly why the Forgotten Man is hiding behind the tree in all these secret areas. The Forgotten Man is clearly someone from Kris's past that Kris is trying to not remember, since he seems to be intrinsically tied to the mental hospital, the place where Kris expressed their trauma in the form of a drawing, before eventually scratching it over and hiding it behind a tree. I think that the tree is meant to be a representation of a hiding spot. After all, what's the most obvious spot for hiding seek than just hiding behind a tree? Maybe this was a spot that Kris or Des used as a hiding spot while they were playing together. And of course, Kris is using this tree as a mental block to hide from their past trauma. I think that this idea of hide-and-seek theory, that Kris feels responsible for Des' disappearance, also explains why Carol is working with Kris. Carol is the Knight, or at the very least is working with the Knight or is associated with them. What exactly Carol's intentions or motivations are in this regard, we'll get back to later, but for now, all we know for certain is that Kris is working for Carol. Kris made some sort of promise to her, and because of that, Kris is now, for all intents and purposes, working for the Knight. And we know this because of how Kris refuses to attack the Knight if they get up the stairs in this dark world, and that the Knight forces Kris to kneel at the end of their battle instead of outright hitting them. So why would Kris be working for the Knight? To understand Kris's motivations for working for the Knight, we should look to other characters that also worked for the Knight to see what their motivations were for obeying them. King works for the Knight because the Knight promises the King revenge on the Lightners. Queen believes that by creating these dark fountains and following the footsteps of the Knight, she can take over the world and create a perfect paradise for Noelle. And Tenna works for the Knight because the Knight promised him attention and love. In all of these instances, the Knight is promising to give them exactly what they want, their deepest desire, in exchange for their obedience. They're not just working for the Knight because they're evil bad guys, they have motivations. And even in Queen's case, she doesn't even know the roaring is a possibility. Which tells us that the reason that Kris is working for the Knight is not just because he's evil or whatever, but because the Knight can provide something to Kris that Kris desperately desires. So, what does Kris desire? It certainly could be freedom, as Kris detests being controlled by the player, and has their own motivations outside of ours. It's certainly possible that the Knight promises Kris their freedom, and that if they obey them, then Kris will be given full autonomy and be able to live without us controlling them. This feels very plausible to me, but I'm more inclined to believe another option more. And this is mainly because there's no feasible way in the game to give Kris their freedom, at least not one we've seen so far. But there is one other thing that Kris desires, and it's something that, based on what we know is possible in Deltarune, up to Chapter 4, is something that can be done. To see Des again. As we learn in Chapter 4 of Deltarune, we know that the Dark Worlds have the ability to bring people back from the dead in some capacity. Gerson was brought back to life in the Dark World as a Darkner, because of his hammer covered in his dust. So it seems really likely that if Des died inside of the bunker, all Kris, or any Lightner for that matter, would have to do is simply open a dark world in the bunker and bada bing bada boom, Des is back. There's also another possibility. If we assume that Carol is the Knight, or again that she works for the Knight or whatever, blah blah blah, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Carol may be taking advantage of the trauma that Kris already has about Des in order to make Kris do their bidding. It makes sense to me that if Kris believes that they are the one responsible for Des' passing, they would be very likely to listen to her mother of all people if she asked Kris for help. This may have even been the exact promise that Kris made to Carol, a promise that Kris would redeem themselves, make up for the harm they believe they're responsible for, a promise that they will help Carol bring Des back. And finally, hide-and-seek theory also explains one other teensy tiny little detail about Deltarune we don't yet fully understand. The weird root. I mean, just think about it. Kris despises the player for making them do the weird route, for making them emotionally abuse and take advantage of Noelle. Now, sure, this obviously makes sense. I mean, if some sort of external influence was forcing you to abuse your childhood best friend, I'm sure you'd be pretty fucking upset about that too. But like, Kris would also be upset if the player forced them to beat up Toriel, or force them to throw Susie off a cliff, or force them to burn down Ices in an arson-based terrorist attack for the glory of the Holiday Administration. My point is, any number of things could upset Kris, but that's not why the weird root exists. It doesn't exist to be purely torture porn for Kris. Narratively and thematically speaking, the reason that the player is able to force Kris into doing the weird route is because of the connection that Kris has with Noelle. Toby Fox would not program the game this way and have it be specifically something that happens with Kris and Noelle if there wasn't a specific point to it. So I ask again, Why does Kris feel so guilty about doing the weird route? Why do they feel so bad about hurting Noelle like this? Because it isn't the first time it's happened. Hide and seek theory explains the connection between Kris, Noelle, and the weird route. Because if Kris feels responsible for Dessa's disappearance, it would explain exactly why Kris has this wrathful rage against the player for making them go through the Snowgrave route. Making Kris do this hurts so much more and is so much more meaningful because it ties into Kris's pre-existing trauma about hurting the holidays. And it certainly doesn't help that Kris wants to help the holidays. They want to help Carol. They want to redeem themselves and bring back Des. And the player actively goes against their interest in the normal route, yes, but especially in the weird route. I'm going to go out on a limb here and try to predict the conclusion of the weird route in Deltarune right here, right now. The weird route in Chapter 2 is all about stripping Noelle of her autonomy and forcing her to become stronger. But why are we trying to make her become stronger? Well, there's of course the idea that we're trying to make her strong enough to overturn the prophecy or just for our personal freedom in the game. It's not really clear. But what is clear is that whatever is happening in Chapter 2's weird route is working as intended. Doing this to Noelle is making her stronger. Not just by her killing enemies, not just by making her kill Birdly, but turning her into this empty husk by hurting her, by emotionally manipulating her and using the Thorn Ring. And what happens in the continuation of the weird route in Chapter 4? We continue hurting her. Even when Kris desperately tries to stop us, to try and undo the damage that we did while away from our control, to apologize to Noelle, take care of Birdly, we undo all of that, rip open those scars, and force her to face the reality that what happened wasn't a dream. And why? Because somehow hurting Noelle is an integral part of this process of making her stronger. If it wasn't, if it was exclusively about killing enemies in the Dark World, the player would just pick up where they left off in the next Dark World that includes Noelle. But we don't. We break Noelle emotionally again and again. So let me ask you this. What is the one thing Kris could do to Noelle that would hurt her more than anything else in the world? And furthermore, what is the one thing that the player could force Kris to do that would hurt Kris more than anything else in the world?